In the gaslit heart of 1888, London, where the chasm between the sprawling slums and the gilded mansions of Mayfair was as wide as the ocean, a single needle could be the difference between salvation and starvation. For a young seamstress named Isabelle Dubois, her needle was her only shield. This isn't just a story of rags to riches. It's the true whispered history of a desperate pact, a marriage of convenience to a man believed to be dying. But the man she married was not who he seemed. He was a keeper of secrets, a master of deception, and the holder of a title so powerful it could shatter her world. This is the story of how a simple seamstress married a sick widower, without knowing he was secretly one of the wealthiest dukes of the realm. The London air in October of 1888 was a thick broth of coal smoke, damp wool, and the clatter of iron-shod hooves on cobblestone. For Isabelle Dubois, it was the scent of survival. From the cramped attic room she shared with her younger sister Lena, the city was a relentless beast, and she fought it daily with a thimble, a needle, and an unwavering will. At 22, her hands were not the delicate appendages of a lady. They were a tradeswoman's tools, calloused and occasionally pricked, but capable of spinning thread into art. Isabelle's parents, French immigrants who had fled the turmoil after the Franco-Prussian War, had bequeathed her two things: their skill with fabric and a mountain of debt upon their untimely passing from influenza. Now Lena, a wisp of a girl at 16 with a persistent cough that echoed their parents' demise, was Isabelle's entire world. Keeping her warm and fed was the singular purpose that drove Isabelle's needle from before the sun rose until the gas lamp hissed its last. Her workshop was a corner of their room, fabrics, piled high patterns, sketched on scrap paper, the air shimmering with motes of dust and lint. But her work was exquisite. She could mend lace so finely the tear became invisible, and she could tailor a gentleman's waistcoat to grant him an authority he didn't possess. Yet it was never enough. The landlord, a portly man named Mr. Finch, with a perpetually damp-looking moustache, was threatening eviction. Lena's medicine, prescribed by a weary parish doctor, was costly. Desperation was a constant, unwelcome guest. It was on a particularly grim Tuesday that the solicitor arrived. He was a dry, thin man named Mr. Abernathy, whose spectacles seemed to magnify the pity in his eyes. He represented a client, a Mr. Ashworth. Mr. Ashworth is a widower, the solicitor explained, his voice as crisp as parchment. His late wife passed a year ago. He is of a delicate constitution himself. He has no family to speak of and requires a companion, a caregiver, someone to manage his modest household and provide a steady, quiet presence in his final years. Isabelle listened. Her needle paused mid-stitch. This sounded like a position for a nurse or a housekeeper, not a seamstress. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat. The arrangement my client proposes is unconventional. He does not wish to hire a servant who can be dismissed. He seeks permanence, stability. He is proposing marriage. Isabelle's heart hammered against her ribs. Marriage to a sick, dying stranger. It was preposterous. It was macabre. He is a good man, Miss Dubois. The solicitor pressed gently. He came to know of you through Dr. Armitage, the parish physician. He heard of your diligence, your devotion to your sister, your predicament. He wishes to offer you a solution. The solution was laid bare. Mr. Ashworth would settle all her debts immediately. He would provide a comfortable home for both her and Lena. He would ensure Lena received the finest medical care not from a parish doctor, but from a private physician. In return, Isabelle would become Mrs. Ashworth, the wife and companion to a man quietly waiting for the end. Upon his death, She would be left a respectable widow, with a small but secure inheritance. Why me? Isabel whispered the question, tasting of suspicion. He believes, Mr. Abernathy said, choosing his words with care, that a woman who fights so fiercely for her own family will possess the compassion and fortitude he requires. He seeks kindness, not passion. A gentle hand, not a society wife. He values your character above all else. Isabel looked at Lena, asleep in their shared bed, a sheen of sweat on her pale brow. She heard Mr. Finch's booming voice in the stairwell demanding the rent. She felt the gnawing emptiness in her own stomach. The proposal was a cage, but it was a gilded one compared to the abyss she was staring into. It was a trade her name, her freedom for Lena's life. She met Mr. Ashworth 2 days later. He lived in a small, respectable but gloomy terraced house in Bloomsbury. The parlour was clean, but threadbare, smelling of lemon polish and decay. He rose to greet her, a tall, gaunt man, who seemed to be held together by his impeccably tailored but worn suit. He couldn't be much older than 30, but his eyes, a startling shade of stormy grey, held the weariness of a much older soul. His name, he said, was Arthur Ashworth. He had a soft, low voice, and a cough that he tried to stifle behind a fine linen handkerchief. He didn't probe or press. He spoke of books and the changing seasons. He asked about Lena with genuine concern. He was gentle, intelligent, and profoundly sad. There was a quiet dignity about him that Isabel found herself respecting. He was not a monster, just a man broken by grief and illness. "I ask for nothing more than your companionship, Miss Dubois," he said, his gaze direct. "That you might read to me in the evenings, manage the accounts, and grant me the peace of knowing I am not entirely alone. Your sister will be cared for, as if she were my own. You have my word." Isabel looked at this frail, lonely man and felt a pang of pity that surprised her. Perhaps this wouldn't be a prison. Perhaps it could be a quiet sanctuary for them all. She accepted. The wedding was a swift, silent affair at a registrar's office a week later. The only witnesses were Mr. Abernathy and a bewildered Lena wrapped in a new wool shawl. Isabel wore a simple grey dress she had made herself her finest work. Arthur Ashworth, her husband, placed a plain gold band on her finger. His hand was cool, his touch brief. As they left the drab office, he leaned heavily on a cane, a fit of coughing shaking his thin frame. Isabel took his arm not as a lover, but as a nurse might. The bargain was sealed. She was Mrs. Ashworth now, the wife of a dying man. She had sold her future to save her sister, and she told herself it was a price worth paying. She had no idea how profoundly she had miscalculated the cost. The first few weeks of her marriage were precisely as Isabel had anticipated. Their life in the Bloomsbury house was a quiet routine of hushed conversations, shared meals, and long silences. Isabel managed the small household with practiced efficiency, while a specialist, a Dr. Peterson, was summoned for Lena. He was a kind elderly man, with a reassuring bedside manner, who changed Lena's medication and prescribed a diet rich in broth and milk. For the first time in years, a fragile bloom of colour returned to her sister's cheeks. Her husband, Arthur, remained a polite enigma. He spent most of his days in his study, surrounded by books on architecture and estate management subjects that seemed oddly ambitious for a man with so little property and supposedly so little time. He was unfailingly courteous, always thanking her for the smallest kindnesses. In the evenings, she would read to him from Dickens or Trollope, his weary eyes closing as her voice filled the quiet room. She found herself growing accustomed to his presence, a strange placid affection, taking root where she had expected only duty. The deception began to unravel on a Monday morning 6 weeks after their wedding. Isabel Arthur said, his voice stronger than usual. Dr. Peterson believes the London air is detrimental to Lena's recovery, and I find myself weary of this house. We will be moving to the country. Isabel's heart leapt with a mixture of hope and anxiety. The country meant fresh air for Lena, but it also meant leaving the only city she had ever known. To a cottage, she asked. A faint, unreadable smile touched his lips. Something of that nature. Please have your and Lena's belongings packed. A carriage will arrive on Friday. Friday came, and with it, not a simple carriage, but a grand lacquered coach bearing a coat of arms she didn't recognize on its door. It was drawn by 4 magnificent, perfectly matched grey horses. A coachman and a footman, both in immaculate livery, managed their meagre luggage with a reverence that felt absurd. Lena's eyes were wide with wonder. Isabel, are we going to see? The Queen Isabel felt a knot of unease tighten in her stomach. I'm sure it's just a hired coach, dearest. But she knew deep down that people like them didn't hire coaches like this. The journey was long, taking them far beyond the smoky grasp of London and into the rolling green heart of the English countryside. Late in the afternoon, they turned onto a private road, passing through an immense wrought-iron gate held open by a gatekeeper who bowed deeply as they passed. They drove for another mile along a gravel path, flanked by ancient oak trees, before the view finally opened up. Isabel gasped. Before them, set against a backdrop of sweeping hills and a vast shimmering lake, stood a house. But to call it a house was like calling St. Paul's a parish church. It was a palace, a breathtaking symphony of golden stone, towering turrets, and countless mullioned windows that glittered in the afternoon sun. Manicured gardens flowed from its terraces down to the lake, and in the distance she could see the faint outlines of a stable block larger than their entire Bloomsbury Street. Arthur, she whispered, her voice trembling, what is this place? The coach pulled to a halt before a grand entrance where a line of servants stood waiting. A severe-looking woman in a black dress, clearly the housekeeper, stood at their head. Arthur turned to her, and for the first time, the mask of the frail, weary Mr. Ashworth slipped away. The weariness in his eyes was still there, but it was now mingled with a deep, profound regret and an undeniable authority. This, Isabel, he said, his voice low and clear, is Northwood Manor. My home. He stepped out of the coach, and as he did, he seemed to shed his frailty like a coat. He stood taller, his shoulders squared. The servants bowed in unison. Your Grace the housekeeper, said her voice, stiff with formality. Your Grace. The title echoed in the cavern of Isabel's mind. It was a form of address reserved for only one rank. A duke. The world tilted on its axis. The man she had married, the sick, humble widower she pitied and cared for, was a fraud. He wasn't Arthur Ashworth. He turned back to her, extending a hand to help her from the carriage. His face was a mask of contrition. My name is not Arthur Ashworth. It is Alistair Beaumont. I am the Duke of Northwood. Isabel stared at him, at the palatial home, at the deferential servants. It was all a lie. The modest house, the simple life, the dying man. Her entire world, the bargain she had made, was built on a foundation of sand. She felt a hot flush of shame, followed by a cold wave of fury. She hadn't just been married. She had been purchased, deceived, and brought here like a prize from a common market. You lied to me, she said, her voice a choked whisper, ignoring his outstretched hand and stepping from the coach on her own. I did, he admitted, his grey eyes searching hers, and I will spend the rest of my life attempting to explain why. Please come inside. We have much to discuss. As she walked on unsteady legs towards the cavernous entrance of Northwood Manor, the new Duchess of Northwood felt more like a prisoner than a princess. The air she had hoped would heal her sister now felt suffocating, and the gilded cage was infinitely more terrifying than the poverty she had fled. The first few days at Northwood Manor were a disorienting fever dream. Isabel was given a suite of rooms so vast and opulent that she and Lena could have lived in the dressing room alone. Silks, velvets, and brocades replaced her simple wool and cotton. Maids appeared as if by magic to draw her bath, style her hair, and lay out her clothes. It was a life of unimaginable luxury, and Isabel had never felt more impoverished. Lena, however, thrived. Unaware of the complexities of the situation, she saw only magic. She was enchanted by the gardens, the ponies in the stables, and the endless supply of jellies and cakes from the kitchen. Dr. Peterson's daily visits now in a much grander setting continued, and the country air worked its wonders. The colour in her cheeks was now a steady, healthy rose. For this, and this alone, Isabel tempered her fury at Alistair. Alistair himself gave her space, occupying a separate wing of the manor. The explanation, when it came, was delivered in the cavernous library, a room lined with thousands of leather-bound books that smelled of history and dust. My first wife. Beatrice. Her death was sudden, he began, his voice strained. He didn't look at her, instead, staring into the cold fireplace. Our marriage was an arrangement, a union of two prominent families. It was not a love match. The world I inhabit, Isabel, is built on titles, fortunes, and alliances. Authenticity is a commodity more precious and rarer than gold. He explained that after Beatrice's death, he had been hounded by the matchmaking mothers of the aristocracy, all eager to present their daughters as the next duchess. He felt like a prize, a title to be won. I was suffocating, he confessed, finally turning to look at her, his grey eyes pleading for understanding. I became convinced that no one would ever see me, Alistair, but only the Duke. I was disillusioned, weary. The deception, it was a desperate act. I wanted to find someone who would be with me for reasons other than my name or my wealth. When Dr. Armitage told me of a fiercely loyal young woman caring for her sister, I saw a person of character. It was selfish, I know, a test that you never consented to. But my intentions, I swear, were to find a genuine soul to share a quiet life with. His sickness, he admitted, had been an exaggeration of a genuine malady. He suffered from bouts of intense melancholia and physical exhaustion, a condition the doctors couldn't explain, but which had worsened in the final months of his marriage to Beatrice. Posing as a dying man was simply the most effective way to ensure his prospective bride's motives were compassionate, not avaricious. Isabel listened, her heart a cold knot in her chest. His explanation painted a picture of a lonely, trapped man, but it didn't erase the sting of his deceit. So, I was an experiment, she asked, her voice sharp, a test subject to prove a point about the nobility. No, he said quickly. Never. You were a hope. But the world he had brought her into was not a quiet life. It was a court, and she was its unwilling, unprepared queen. The staff, led by the formidable housekeeper Mrs. Gable, watched her every move. Mrs. Gable had been with the Beaumont family for 40 years and had adored the late Duchess. Her disapproval of Isabel, the common seamstress, who had somehow taken her lady's place, was a palpable force in the house. She corrected Isabel's speech, her posture, her manner of addressing the staff, her every correction, a subtle reminder that she did not belong. The servants' whispers followed her down the long, portrait-lined corridors. They spoke of Lady Beatrice, her beauty, her elegance, her impeccable taste. She was a paragon of aristocratic grace, a goddess to their commoner goddess usurper. Isabel saw her everywhere in the opulent decor, the grand portraits that depicted a stunningly beautiful woman with cold porcelain features, and in the lingering scent of lilac in her rooms. Then, a week into their stay, Lord Frederick Beaumont arrived. He was Alistair's cousin, and the next in line for the dukedom should Alistair die without an heir. He was handsome, charming, and possessed an easy grace that made Alistair seem all the more brooding and remote. Cousin, he boomed, striding into the drawing-room and embracing Alistair. I heard you had returned and brought with you a surprise. And what a delightful surprise she is. He turned his charismatic smile on Isabel, taking her hand and bowing low to kiss it. Your Grace, it is an honor. Alistair has kept you a complete secret. I am devastated. His charm felt practiced, his eyes overly bright. Throughout his visit, he treated Isabel with a cloying, patronizing courtesy. He complimented her simple, rustic beauty and asked her about her fascinating former life, his questions designed to highlight her lowly origins in front of the listening servants. He spoke often and fondly of Beatrice. Ah, Beatrice. He sighed, looking at her portrait over the mantelpiece, the life of the party. She adored this house, knew every secret, every treasure. It must be so daunting for you, my dear, stepping into such large shoes. One evening, Isabel overheard him speaking with Mrs. Gable in the hall. Their voices were low, but the words were clear. Unfit, I tell you, Frederick was saying. A seamstress. The family name will be a laughing stock. What could he have been thinking? His Grace has not been himself since Lady Beatrice passed. Mrs. Gable replied, her voice tight. He is unwell. Unwell is one word for it, Frederick muttered. We must hope he comes to his senses, for the sake of the Beaumont legacy. That night Isabel lay awake in her ridiculously large canopy bed, the silken sheets feeling like shackles. She was an impostor in this house, surrounded by the ghost of a perfect predecessor and watched by hostile eyes. Her husband was a stranger who had lied to her, and his cousin was a smiling viper. She had traded her freedom for this gilded prison, and she was beginning to fear that the secrets held within its walls were far darker than a simple case of a duke's deception. Isabel felt utterly adrift. Her days were a hollow performance of being a duchess, a role for which she had no script. She sat through endless silent meals with Alistair in a dining room that could seat 50. She walked the manicured gardens, feeling the eyes of the gardeners on her back. She was a doll dressed by maids, fed by cooks, and displayed in a house that was not her home. The one thing that had defined her, her work, her skill, was gone. Here ladies did not work. One rainy afternoon, consumed by a restless energy, she found herself in the suite of rooms that had belonged to Beatrice. They had been left untouched, a perfect sterile shrine to the late Duchess. Maids entered only to dust. On a whim, driven by a need to understand the woman whose shadow she lived in, Isabel opened the vast wardrobe. It was a cavern of couture. Gowns from the finest designers in Paris and London. Worth Paquin Creed hung in scented protective bags. It was a collection worth a fortune, a testament to a life of unimaginable indulgence. But as Isabel ran her fingers over the exquisite fabrics, her seamstress's eye saw more than just beautiful dresses. She saw the construction, the boning, the intricate darting. And she saw flaws, a slightly crooked seam here, a puckered dart there. These were not the mistakes of a master couturier. They were alterations, quick, impatient ones. Curiosity piqued, she began to examine the collection more closely. In the back of the wardrobe, she found a series of simpler, plainer gowns. These were well made, but far less ostentatious. Tucked into the pocket of one was a receipt from a modest dressmaker in a London borough, a name she recognized as being known for discretion, not high fashion. Why would the glamorous Duchess of Northwood need a discreet dressmaker? Her search led her to the attached dressing room. It was dominated by a large vanity table, its surface cluttered with silver-backed brushes and crystal-perfumed bottles. But Isabel was drawn to the collection of hat boxes stacked in a corner, bearing the labels of London's finest milliners. One from a less fashionable but still respected maker named Madame Dubois. A coincidence that sent a small shiver down her spine, felt heavier than the others. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was not a hat, but a collection of items. A few bundles of letters tied with ribbon, a small locked cash box, and a thick leather-bound book. A ledger. Her heart pounding, Isabel took the ledger and retreated to her own rooms, hiding it beneath the cushions of a window seat. That night, after Lena was asleep and the house was silent, she retrieved it. It was not a personal diary. The pages were filled with neat columns of dates, names reduced to single initials and sums of money. At first, she thought it was a record of household expenses or gambling debts. But the entries were odd. October 5th F, $50. For information, November 12th. Dr. A, $100. For special tonic, December 1st F, $75. Silence, January 22nd. Dr. A, $150. Stronger dose required. The entries continued for nearly 2 years, a steady stream of payments. F appeared frequently, always associated with large sums and cryptic notes like discretion or silence. And then there was Dr. A and the repeated mention of tonics and medicines. Isabel's blood ran cold. Alistair's strange recurring illness, his periods of exhaustion and melancholy. They had always seemed to worsen after Frederick's visits. F. Frederick. Could it be the idea was monstrous? She remembered Alistair mentioning his doctor at the time had been a man named Dr. Albright, a man Frederick himself had recommended after Alistair's previous physician retired. Dr. A. The pieces began to click into place with terrifying speed. This wasn't a record of Beatrice's expenses. It was a record of a conspiracy. She sat with the ledger for a long time, the silence of the grand house pressing in on her. She held proof of something dark and sinister. But what was she to do with it? Who would believe her, the commoner upstart, against the charming Lord Frederick? And the sainted memory of Lady Beatrice accusing them would be tantamount to declaring war on the entire Beaumont family. But then she thought of Alistair, the lonely, deceived man in the library, the man who, for all his lies, had saved her sister. He had been a victim of a far greater deception than the one he had perpetrated on her. He believed he was simply unwell, perhaps genetically frail, when in fact he was being poisoned. Her anger at him for his lies began to recede, replaced by a fierce protective instinct. They had tried to hurt him, to perhaps even kill him, and they had used his dead wife to do it. She closed the ledger. The seamstress who felt so useless had just found a thread, and she was going to pull on it until the entire rotten tapestry of lies unraveled. She finally had a purpose in this house. She was no longer just the accidental Duchess. She was the keeper of a secret that could either destroy them all or finally set them free. Armed with the ledger, Isabel faced a critical choice. She could try to expose the plot on her own, a risky endeavor for an outsider. Or she could do the one thing that went against every instinct for self-preservation she possessed. She could trust her husband. She had to trust Alistair. She found him late that night in his study, staring into the embers of a dying fire, a glass of brandy untouched beside him. He looked up as she entered, his expression weary but questioning. "I need to show you something," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She placed the heavy ledger on the desk between them. I found this in Beatrice's dressing room. Alistair stared at the book, a flicker of pain crossing his face at the mention of his first wife. Her accounts, I presume. Beatrice was always meticulous with her expenses. "I don't think these are for gowns and hats," Isabel said softly, opening the ledger to a page filled with the damning entries. "Alistair, who is F?" He scanned the page, his brow furrowing in confusion, then in dawning horror. He traced the entry Dr. A. $150. Stronger dose required. Dr. Albright, he whispered the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. Frederick recommended him. He sank into his chair, the blood draining from his face. The strength he had projected since their arrival at Northwood Manor evaporated, leaving behind the vulnerable sick man she had first met in Bloomsbury. The puzzle pieces he had struggled with for years, his inexplicable fatigue, the metallic taste that sometimes laced his food, the way his symptoms always flared after a visit from his solicitous cousin, were now locking into a sickening, undeniable picture. All this time, he murmured, his voice hollow with disbelief. I thought I was losing my mind, or simply fading. They were poisoning me. In that moment, Isabel saw past the Duke. She saw a man profoundly betrayed, not just by his cousin, but by the wife he had at the very least trusted to not actively try to murder him. An instinct she didn't know she possessed rose up in her. She moved around the desk and placed a hand on his shoulder. His muscles were rigid with tension. "We know now," she said, her voice firm, "and we can fight it." That night marked a profound shift in their relationship. The wall of deception between them crumbled, replaced by the foundation of a shared, dangerous purpose. The grand study became their war room. For hours they pored over the ledger, Isabel's sharp mind and eye for detail, complementing Alistair's knowledge of his family and their circle. Beatrice was deeply in debt, Alistair revealed, piecing together memories. She loved the lifestyle, the gambling tables in Monte Carlo. Frederick often covered her losses. I thought he was just being a kind cousin. He was buying her complicity, Isabel countered, pointing to an entry. "Look. Payment to F, $500. Casino debt cleared." He wasn't just helping her. He was owning her. The motive became chillingly clear. Frederick, burdened by his own debts, coveted the Northwood title and fortune. With Alistair dead and Beatrice as a grieving, pliable widow under his control, he would have effective command of the entire estate. If Beatrice had then tragically died, he would have inherited everything. But Beatrice died first. Alistair mused a dark irony in his tone. Her horse took a fall during a hunt. It was deemed a tragic accident. Was it? Isabel asked quietly. They looked at each other, the unspoken possibility hanging in the air. Had Beatrice, having served her purpose, become a liability Frederick needed to erase? Over the next week they worked in secret. Alistair, now wary of everything, instructed the kitchen that only Isabel was to prepare his personal tea and pour his wine. He sent a trusted agent to London to discreetly investigate Dr. Albright, who it turned out had a reputation for prescribing discreet remedies to wealthy clients and had a history of gambling problems. Another agent confirmed Frederick was teetering on the edge of financial ruin. As they worked, a new intimacy grew between them. They were no longer the Duke and the Seamstress, but Alistair and Isabel, partners, allied against a common foe. He saw the keen intelligence she had always possessed, the quiet strength that had allowed her to survive the London slums. He found himself admiring her resilience, her unwavering moral compass. She in turn saw the man behind the title. She saw his pain, his loneliness, and the deep well of integrity that his cousin so sorely lacked. She saw the way his eyes softened when he looked at Lena playing in the garden, and the genuine remorse he held for his deception of her. One evening, as they sat opposite each other, the ledger between them, he reached across the desk and took her hand. "I brought you here under false pretenses, Isabel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I offered you a cage, believing it was a sanctuary. Instead, you have become the one person I can trust. You are more of a duchess in your character than Beatrice ever was in her breeding." Isabel's heart, which she had guarded so fiercely, began to thaw. Looking at the man holding her hand, she realized she was no longer playing a role. The strange, placid affection she had felt for the sick Mr. Ashworth was blossoming into a fierce, complicated love for Alistair Beaumont, the embattled Duke. They were not just fighting for his life and his title, they were fighting for their future, and they would lay their trap carefully. The Northwood Autumn Ball was a legendary event in the aristocratic calendar. Alistair, claiming he felt a resurgence of health and wanted to properly introduce his new duchess to society, announced it would proceed as planned. An invitation was of course extended to his dear cousin, Lord Frederick. It was the perfect stage for their confrontation, public, inescapable, and laden with irony. A masquerade ball where everyone wore a mask. Isabel was a vision. Alistair had commissioned a gown for her from the finest dressmaker in London, but she had directed the design herself. It was a masterpiece of deep sapphire silk, exquisitely embroidered with silver thread that shimmered like starlight. It was the work of a duchess, but the skill was that of a master seamstress. She wore a simple silver mask that covered her eyes, but her regal bearing was disguise enough. For the first time, walking down the grand staircase on Alistair's arm, she felt she belonged. The ballroom was a dazzling sea of silks, jewels, and anonymous faces. Frederick arrived late, making a typically grand entrance. He wore the mask of a cunning fox, a choice Isabel found grimly appropriate. He greeted them with his usual oily charm, his eyes lingering on Isabel, with a look that was both admiring and possessive. "Cousin, you look restored, and Duchess, you are a triumph," he purred. "The country life clearly agrees with you both." Throughout the evening they played their parts. Alistair appeared jovial and relaxed, while Isabel was a gracious, if reserved, hostess. They watched as Frederick moved through the crowd, charming the ladies, sharing jokes with the men, completely unaware of the net that was closing around him. The moment came just after midnight, as the orchestra paused between waltzes. Alistair stood on the dais at the head of the ballroom and tapped a crystal glass for attention. A hush fell over the masked assembly. "My friends," Alistair began, his voice resonating with newfound strength. "Thank you for joining us to celebrate. Many of you have commented on my improved health. For this, I have two people to thank. The first is my wonderful wife, Isabel, whose care has been a balm to my soul." He smiled at her, a genuine loving smile that made her heart soar. The crowd murmured its polite approval. The second, he continued, his voice hardening, his eyes finding the fox mask in the crowd, is my cousin, Lord Frederick Beaumont. A ripple of surprise went through the room. Frederick puffed out his chest, a self-satisfied smirk visible beneath his mask. "For years my cousin has shown me nothing but the deepest concern for my well-being. He even recommended my personal physician, a Dr. Albright, who prescribed a most potent series of tonics." Alistair's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Tonics designed, I have recently learned, to cure me of my fortune, my title, and ultimately my life." The silence in the ballroom was absolute, heavy, and shocked. Every masked face turned towards Frederick. "Alistair, what is this nonsense?" Frederick laughed, a brittle, unconvincing sound. "Have you been drinking? This is a jest in the poorest taste." "It is no jest," Alistair's voice boomed. He held up a familiar leather-bound book. "My late wife, it seems, was a meticulous record-keeper." Isabel watched Frederick's face. Beneath the mask, his confident smirk dissolved. His eyes darted towards the exits. Alistair began to read from the ledger. He read the dates, the payments, the notes about stronger doses. He read the entries detailing how Frederick had paid off Beatrice's gambling debts in exchange for her assistance in the slow, systematic poisoning. "This is slander forgery," Frederick shouted, his voice cracking. "That woman was a commoner. This is her desperate attempt to slander my name and secure her position." He pointed a shaking finger at Isabel. This was her cue. Isabel stepped forward, her composure unshakable. "You are right about one thing, Lord Frederick. I am a commoner. I am a seamstress." Her voice, though not loud, carried to every corner of the silent room. And as a seamstress, I noticed details others might miss. Like the unique blend of French lilac water that the late Duchess favoured, a scent that to this day clings faintly to the pages of her private ledger. She then produced the final damning piece of evidence. "I also know my trade, and I recognize the discreet stitchwork of a very particular London dressmaker, Madame Pelletier, known for sewing hidden pockets into her clients' garments. A pocket in which I believe the late Duchess carried this." She held up a small empty vial, one she had found tucked away in the lining of a travelling cloak, a vial Alistair's agents had confirmed was from Dr. Albright's apothecary, containing trace amounts of digitalis, derived from the foxglove plant, a poison known to mimic the symptoms of heart disease. Frederick was trapped. His face, now stripped of its mask, was a ghastly white. He saw the cold, unforgiving faces of his peers, the people whose opinion he valued above all else. He saw the two constables who had entered the ballroom discreetly and were now standing by the main doors. His bravado shattered. With a guttural cry of fury and despair, he lunged not at Alistair, but at Isabel, the architect of his ruin. But Alistair, no longer the frail invalid, was faster. He intercepted his cousin, landing a solid punch that sent Frederick sprawling to the polished floor. The masquerade was over. As the constables hauled a screaming, defeated Lord Frederick away, Alistair turned to Isabel. In front of the entire scandalized assembly of high society, the Duke of Northwood took his seamstress wife in his arms. He gently removed her silver mask, and then his own. "Thank you," he whispered for her ears only. "You saved me, Isabel." She looked into his eyes, clear and free from the haze of poison and suspicion, for the first time. "No, Alistair," she replied, a soft smile on her lips. "We saved each other." The scandal of the Northwood Autumn Ball detonated with the force of a cannonade in the meticulously ordered world of the British aristocracy. It was not a quiet affair to be managed with discreet apologies and temporary rustication. It was a public spectacle. Lord Frederick's dramatic arrest, witnessed by 200 of the realm's most influential figures, ensured that. The morning papers were a frenzy of ink and outrage. The Morning Post and the Times reported the events with a veneer of shocked solemnity, speaking in hushed tones of the unfortunate Beaumont affair and the diabolical conspiracy uncovered by the new Duchess. The penny dreadfuls, however, revelled in the lurid details, printing sensationalized sketches of the masked ball, the ledger, and the dramatic confrontation, dubbing Isabel the seamstress Duchess who unstitched a plot. For weeks, no dinner party or society gathering was complete without a whispered, often wildly inaccurate retelling of the story. Some pitied Alistair for being so thoroughly deceived, while others criticized him for bringing a commoner into their midst, as if her very presence had invited such melodrama. But through it all, a different narrative began to take hold. It was a story not of a foolish duke, but of a resilient one, and of a duchess whose sharp mind and common-sense courage had accomplished what an entire generation of aristocratic breeding had failed to do, expose the rot within its own house. Lord Frederick Beaumont's trial was a swift and brutal affair. Alistair, seeking to shield the family name from the ultimate disgrace of a murder trial, instructed his solicitors to pursue charges of conspiracy and extensive financial fraud. The evidence meticulously laid out in Beatrice's ledger and supported by the testimony of a terrified Dr. Albright was irrefutable. Frederick's defense that he was the victim of a clever commoner's ambition crumbled under the weight of his own documented deceit. He stood in the dock not with remorse, but with a sneering aristocratic arrogance that alienated the jury completely. His sentence was not the gallows, but a form of living death for a man of his standing transportation to the penal colonies of Australia. He was to be stripped of his name, his assets liquidated to cover his debts, and erased from the peerage. The Beaumont name was deeply tarnished, but through Alistair's decisive action, it was not irrevocably broken. In the quiet, raw aftermath at Northwood Manor, the house itself seemed to exhale. The first order of business was a meeting in the morning room. Mrs. Gable, her face pale and etched with a profound shame she could not conceal, stood before Isabel. She was not dressed in her usual starched black uniform of authority, but in a simple grey dress, her hands clasped tightly before her. "Your Grace," she began, her voice brittle, "there is no excuse for my behavior. I was blinded by my loyalty to a memory, and I treated you with a cruelty and suspicion you never deserved. I have failed in my duty to this house and to its rightful master and mistress. I offer you my resignation, effective immediately." Isabel looked at the formidable woman, now humbled and broken. She saw not an enemy, but another victim of Beatrice and Frederick's manipulations. To dismiss her would be easy. To redeem her would be an act of true leadership. Mrs. Gable Isabel said, her tone gentle but firm, gesturing for the housekeeper to sit, an unheard-of gesture that made the older woman flinch. "You were loyal to what you believed was the legacy of this house. Your error was in believing that legacy was tied to one person, to a name rather than to the integrity of the family itself. I have no interest in a household run by ghosts, but I have every interest in one run with experience, dedication, and an unflinching eye for the truth. Your expertise is invaluable to Northwood. I will not accept your resignation. I will, however, accept your renewed loyalty, given freely to this family as it stands now, to the Duke, to myself, and to the future we intend to build." Tears welled in Mrs. Gable's eyes. She nodded, unable to speak, her 40 years of rigid composure finally cracking. In that moment, Isabel did not just secure a housekeeper. She earned an unshakable ally who would from that day forward manage Northwood with a fierce devotion to its new duchess. With the public drama fading and the household reset, a new, profound intimacy settled between Isabel and Alistair. The vast, echoing halls of the manor no longer felt like a prison to her. They explored the estate together, walking for hours through ancient woodlands and along the shores of the lake. He shared the history of his family, not as a lecture, but as a series of stories about the people behind the portraits. She in turn told him of her life in London, of the scent of hot ironing and the camaraderie of the other seamstresses, painting a vivid picture of a world he had never known. Their marriage, born of a lie, was reborn in truth. The change was palpable. One evening, as they sat in the library, the room where they had first united against their common enemy, Alistair took her hand. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow on the thousands of books that surrounded them. "Our first vows were a contract, Isabel. A cold legal document built on my deception," he said, his voice low and earnest. It is a stain on our beginning that I will always regret. I wish to make a new vow to you, not as a duke to his duchess, but as Alistair to Isabel." He stood and pulled her to her feet. There, with only the silent, leather-bound witnesses of history looking on, he made his promise. He spoke not of duty or titles, but of his admiration for her spirit, his gratitude for her courage, and his deep, unwavering love. He vowed to be her partner, her confidant, and her sanctuary for all the days of his life. Tears streamed down Isabel's face as she made her own vow in return. She spoke of the frightened seamstress she had been, and how in his flawed, desperate search for honesty, he had given her a chance, not just for survival, but for a life she could never have imagined. She vowed to be his anchor, his counsel, and to love him not for his title or his estate, but for the good and honourable man he was. It was a ceremony of two more, sacred and binding than any church wedding, sealing a union that had been tested by fire and emerged as strong as steel. Isabel embraced her role as duchess, but on her own terms. She had no patience for the endless cycle of vapid social calls and malicious gossip that consumed many aristocratic women. She saw her new position not as a pinnacle of leisure, but as a platform of influence. Her great project was born from a memory, the sight of young, tired girls in London, their fingers raw from needlework, their futures as narrow as the eye of the needle they pushed. With Alistair's enthusiastic blessing and the full financial might of the Northwood estate, she transformed the long-disused West Wing into the Northwood Guild for Needlework. It was a revolutionary concept. It was not a charity doling out soup, but a professional institution. Girls from the tenant farms and surrounding villages were invited to learn a trade. Isabel herself, often with Lena by her side, taught the advanced classes in design and tailoring. They learned not just to sew, but to read patterns, manage ledgers, and negotiate prices. The guild soon earned a reputation for excellence, securing contracts to provide livery for other great houses, and even fine embroidery for London dressmakers. Isabel had given these young women more than a skill. She had given them economic freedom. Years later, the light of a late afternoon sun would filter through the tall library windows, illuminating the silver in Isabel's hair. She would sit in a comfortable chair, a piece of embroidery in her lap, her hands, though now softer still, moving with the practiced grace of a master artisan. Her children, and later her grandchildren, would run through the halls of a house that was no longer haunted by secrets, but filled with laughter and love. Alistair, his hair now grey, but his eyes still full of adoration for his wife, would sit with her, their comfortable silence a testament to a lifetime of shared understanding. She would often reflect on her incredible journey. It was not a fairy tale. Fairy tales were about passive princesses being rescued. Her life had been one of action, of agency. She had walked willingly into a bargain, faced down a monstrous betrayal, and used the very skills from her old life to save her new one. She had not married a prince and been given a kingdom. She had forged a partnership with a lonely, embattled man, and together, piece by piece, they had untangled the rotten threads of the past and stitched together a future, a family, and a dukedom of their very own making. And so the story of Isabel Dubois, the seamstress, who became a duchess, comes to a close. Her journey reminds us that true nobility isn't found in a title or a bloodline, but in courage, intelligence, and the quiet strength of one's character. She wasn't rescued by a prince. She was a partner who exposed a dark conspiracy, and in doing so found not just love, but her own power. Theirs was a love story born not of a fairy tale fantasy, but forged in deception and redeemed by truth, proving that the strongest bonds are woven with threads of trust and mutual respect. If their incredible story of love, betrayal, and resilience moved you, please let us know by hitting that like button. What part of Isabel and Alistair's journey captivated you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Don't forget to share this tale with anyone who loves a story where the heroine saves the day. And of course, for more hidden histories and epic romances brought to life, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss the stories we uncover next. Thank you for listening.